On December 5, 1872, the crew of the brigantine Dei Grazia saw a vessel moving strangely across the Atlantic, not drifting helplessly and not sailing with purpose but wandering as if no human hand guided the wheel, and Captain Albert Richardson felt unease before he understood why, because ships did not move like that unless something had gone wrong. Yet through his spyglass he saw full sails, steady rigging, and a hull without storm damage, which made the sight more disturbing than a wreck, because this was not a dead ship, this was a living ship without life. And as Dei Grazia drew closer, the name Mary Celeste became visible, a merchant brigantine that had left New York weeks earlier bound for Genoa with a cargo of industrial alcohol, commanded by the experienced American Captain Benjamin Briggs, a man known for discipline, caution, and deep faith, not the type to lose control, not the type to vanish, and certainly not the type to abandon a seaworthy ship in open ocean. Yet as Richardson watched the vessel adjust slightly to the wind as if touched by invisible hands, a colder thought took hold: either something forced everyone off or no one remained alive to guide her, and maritime law left him one choice to investigate, because an unmanned ship at sea was both danger and opportunity, a possible salvage claim and a possible crime scene. And he ordered a boarding party lowered into a small boat that rose and fell against dark swells while sailors rowed toward the silent brigantine, calling out, first politely, then loudly, then desperately, but no voice answered, no figure appeared, only the creak of timber and the snap of canvas. And when they climbed aboard they found not chaos but order, not destruction but absence. The deck was wet but not flooded, the rigging intact, one sail damaged but reparable, the hatches closed, the cargo hold undisturbed. And this normality made the silence unbearable, because disaster leaves scars and violence leaves signs, but here there was only the neatness of a place recently lived in and suddenly abandoned. The wheel stood unattended yet functional, the compass present, the sextant missing, the ship papers gone, the marine chronometer absent, items a captain would take only if he intended to navigate away in a smaller boat. And that discovery struck hard, because it meant the crew had not been slaughtered, not swept overboard by a single wave. They had left deliberately together in the only lifeboat, a small yawl that could never match the endurance of the brigantine. And in the captain cabin the boarding sailors found personal belongings untouched, clothing folded, a sewing machine belonging to the captain, wife secured, and a child toy left behind. And this detail turned mystery into human tragedy, because aboard had sailed not only sailors but a family, Captain Briggs, his wife Sarah, and their young daughter, people who would not risk the open ocean in a fragile boat unless the alternative felt worse, unless something aboard had convinced an experienced captain that remaining on his own ship meant certain death. Yet there were no burn marks, no explosion damage, no signs of fire despite volatile cargo. And when the galley was checked, food and water were plentiful, nothing suggested starvation or desperation. The logbook lay open with its final entry dated November 25, giving coordinates near the Azores, hundreds of miles from where she was found, meaning the ship had sailed alone for more than a week, guided only by wind and current, a ghost crew of physics and chance. And as Richardson stood on the silent deck he faced a decision: to tow the ship to port and claim salvage, or leave behind a floating question no one could answer. And he chose to take her in, not knowing he was steering into one of the greatest maritime mysteries in recorded history, a case that would outlive every witness and begin with one impossible fact: a ship in working order, sails set, cargo intact, lifeboat gone, and every soul aboard vanished without a trace. Weeks earlier, on November 7, 1872, Mary Celeste lay moored in New York Harbor loading 1,701 barrels of denatured industrial alcohol bound for Genoa, a routine commercial shipment that should have meant profit and paperwork. Yet on deck stood a man whose caution bordered on obsession: Captain Benjamin Briggs, 37 years old, veteran of the Atlantic, respected by owners and crews, a deeply religious New Englander who did not drink or gamble and kept detailed journals about weather, navigation, and crew discipline, the sort of captain insurers trusted and sailors respected. And this voyage was meant to be steady, predictable, and safe, because Briggs brought something most captains never risked at sea: his family, his wife Sarah and their 2-year-old daughter, who boarded with trunks of clothing, books, and sewing supplies, assuming they would reach Italy before Christmas, while Briggs left his young son with relatives, believing the crossing too demanding for 2 children, a decision that later deepened the tragedy because it proved he thought ahead and measured risk, and the crew he selected reflected the same discipline: experienced sailors with North Sea and Atlantic backgrounds, men accustomed to harsh weather, strict watches, and cargo vessels carrying volatile materials. And when Mary Celeste finally departed after delays for cargo and paperwork, she followed a known route down the eastern coast, catching Atlantic currents, then east toward the islands of the mid-ocean before turning for the Mediterranean. And nothing in those first days suggested danger, because reconstructed weather logs from Nearby ships described moderate winds and manageable seas, not the kind of storms that smash masts or roll vessels, and Briggs' log entries later recorded routine details: speed, heading, sail adjustments, the handwriting steady, the tone calm, the language of a captain in control. And that normality now forms the first layer of the mystery, because disasters usually leave a trail: mechanical failures, crew disputes, worsening weather, navigational errors. Yet here there is only competence, routine, and a ship moving steadily eastward with a captain who had every reason to keep his family safe and cargo intact. And as the brigantine slipped beyond sight of land, she became one of thousands of vessels crossing predictable routes, unseen, unremarkable, and unknowingly sailing toward a moment when something would occur so sudden and so decisive that an experienced captain would look at his solid floating world and decide that abandoning it for a small open boat was the safer choice, a decision that makes no sense at the start, which is why historians keep returning to these early days, searching for the first invisible crack in a journey that looked by every measurable standard completely ordinary. The last confirmed human trace aboard Mary Celeste comes from the captain logbook, a document historians still analyze because it captures the final moments when order still existed, and the final entry, dated November 25, 1872, records a position placing the vessel near the Azores with routine notes about course and speed. Nothing frantic, nothing suggesting panic, no mention of damaged rigging, no report of leaking hull, no record of illness or conflict, just the calm handwriting of a captain doing his job. And that calmness becomes the first contradiction, because within days every person aboard would be gone and the ship would continue sailing alone, meaning whatever happened did not begin as visible chaos, it began quietly in a space between normality and alarm that we can no longer see. And historians reconstruct those missing days by comparing weather logs from nearby ships, which show shifting winds and moderate seas, conditions uncomfortable but common, not the kind of storm that would force immediate evacuation. Yet inspection later noted one sail damaged, some rigging loose, decks wet but the hull sound, the cargo secure, and the vessel capable of reaching port, which raises the question again: why would an experienced captain decide this ship was unsafe? And clues appear in small details: a sounding rod used to measure water in the bilge found out of place, suggesting recent concern about flooding. One pump partially disassembled, possibly clogged, while the other pump worked, and there was water in the hold but not enough to threaten buoyancy. A level sailors considered manageable, yet if Briggs attempted to sound the hold with faulty equipment he might have believed water was rising dangerously. And at sea uncertainty can feel more terrifying than damage, and further signs suggest preparation, not chaos: the chronometer and sextant missing, the yawl gone, indicating organized departure, no sign of struggle anywhere on deck or below, no blood, no broken furniture, no weapons drawn, and personal belongings remained: clothing folded, valuables untouched, money left behind, arguing strongly against piracy or mutiny. And food and fresh water were still plentiful, eliminating starvation, while the cargo showed minor leakage in some barrels, something not unusual, yet no evidence of fire or explosion damage. And this detail later shaped one of the most discussed theories, because alcohol vapor is highly flammable and buildup in the hold could produce a sudden pressure event, frightening the crew without leaving burn marks. But in these final days recorded in ink we see none of that yet, only routine navigation, steady progress, and a captain who appears confident, which makes the coming decision to step off a seaworthy ship into a small open boat in the Atlantic feel less like disaster and more like perception, a moment when Briggs may have believed the danger inside the hull was greater than the danger of the sea outside. And that psychological turning point, invisible in writing, marks the last boundary between the world we can document and the silence that follows. When the boarding party completed their first sweep, the impression was disbelief, because nothing matched the idea of emergency: the decks cluttered with working gear, not cleared in panic, not smashed by waves, and below decks the scene grew stranger: the cargo hold still packed with barrels of alcohol, most intact, a few leaking slightly but no signs of combustion, no scorching, no blast damage, only the heavy sharp smell of spirits lingering. And that smell may have been stronger days earlier, especially if fumes accumulated. And while no sailor collapsed during inspection, they noted the odor, a reminder that invisible hazards can feel immediate. And in the crew quarters bedding remained, sea chests unopened, personal pipes and clothing undisturbed, suggesting men who expected to return, not sailors fleeing forever. While in the captain cabin the sewing machine sat, secured, fabric threaded, and a small pair of children's shoes rested where last placed, a domestic still life preserved by absence. And on the chart table navigational papers were missing, along with the sextant and chronometer, meaning Briggs' organized departure. And yet the logbook left behind stopped days earlier, creating a gap between recorded calm and total disappearance. And on deck the yawl was gone, but the towing line showed signs of separation, leaving debate Whether the lifeboat drifted free after an attempt to tow it or whether the crew intentionally separated believing distance meant safety and the pumps offered another puzzle, one disassembled the other working and sailors relied on sounding rods, so a faulty reading combined with a disabled pump could convince a captain that flooding was worse than reality, and in rough seas the sloshing of liquid cargo can amplify the sound of water, creating the illusion of a ship filling when it is not, and this confusion may have unfolded in darkness or heavy weather when every creak felt like failure. Yet even in this scenario, abandoning a capable vessel remains last resort, and Briggs was cautious, not rash, which suggests he believed danger was immediate, perhaps an alcohol vapor ignition, a sudden pressure event that shook the hull without leaving burn marks, something modern chemistry recognizes as possible. And if such an event occurred, even without flame, the shock and smell could convince those aboard that a larger explosion was seconds away, forcing temporary evacuation into the yawl with intention to return once danger passed, a plan that works only if the small boat remains secured, but if a line snapped in heavy seas the yawl would drift away, leaving the brigantine to continue under sail while the people disappeared beyond the horizon. And this chain of small rational decisions leading to irreversible separation forms one of the strongest modern explanations, because it requires no violence, no supernatural force, only misinterpreted evidence, volatile cargo, and the unforgiving mathematics of distance at sea, where a few hundred meters can become miles within hours. And as the boarding crew catalogued these clues, they faced a ship that looked paused rather than ruined, a moment frozen between danger and safety, with every object whispering that life had been present just long enough ago to leave warmth behind, but not long enough for anyone to explain why they stepped away from the one place built to keep them alive. When Mary Celeste was brought into Gibraltar, the mystery transformed into testimony and suspicion, because maritime law required a salvage hearing, and salvage meant money, and money meant motive, and officials questioned whether the crew of Dei Grazia had found an abandoned ship or engineered one. And presiding over the inquiry was Frederick Solly Flood, the Attorney General, who viewed the silent brigantine as potential fraud because insurance scams involving staged abandonments were known, and he wondered if Captain Albert Richardson and his men had murdered the crew and claimed salvage on a ghost story, a theory dramatic enough for headlines but fragile under evidence. And hearings dragged on as surveyors examined hull, sails, cargo, and logbook, searching for hidden damage, bloodstains, or signs of struggle, but none appeared. The hull showed no collision, no storm breach, the cargo largely intact, and while some barrels were empty, experts determined evaporation explained the loss, and medical inspection found no trace of violence. Testimony from the Dei Grazia crew remained consistent, describing the same eerie order aboard, yet Solly Flood remained suspicious, suggesting mutiny, drunken violence, or fraud, but lacked proof, and without proof courts could not sustain accusation. And eventually the court ruled the salvage legitimate, awarding only partial payment reflecting suspicion without charge, and Mary Celeste returned to service, her name now tied to rumor but not to crime. And this outcome is critical because official investigation with access to the ship found no evidence of piracy, no confirmed mutiny, no deliberate scuttling, only unanswered questions. And those questions moved from courtroom to newspaper, where readers fascinated by sea lore amplified the mystery, adding invented details such as meals left on tables and clocks still ticking, embellishments later repeated so often they overshadowed facts. And this distortion marks the second life of Mary Celeste, not as maritime case but as cultural myth. Yet beneath exaggeration the record remains sober. A seaworthy ship abandoned, navigational instruments missing, lifeboat gone, no violence proven, no storm recorded severe enough to force evacuation, and a crew of experienced sailors and cautious captain who made a decision historians still reconstruct. And as the case closed, the real mystery hardened, because legal systems resolve claims, not uncertainty. And once the ship sailed again, the last physical witness to whatever happened left harbor, carrying answers never written, leaving only transcripts, weather logs, and human inference to fill the space where 9 people once stood looking at the same horizon and deciding that staying aboard was more dangerous than leaving. With the inquiry closed, the mystery shifted to historical analysis, and over the next century maritime experts, chemists, navigators, and weather historians revisited the evidence, stripping away myth and testing what remained against physics and human behavior. And among all explanations, a small group of realistic scenarios stands above the rest, because they require no violence, no supernatural force, only misread signals and cautious decisions under pressure. And the most discussed centers on the cargo, 1,701 barrels of denatured alcohol, a substance that evaporates easily, releasing flammable vapor heavier than air, capable of accumulating in the hold. And experiments in modern times demonstrated that such vapor could ignite in a brief flash explosion, producing a loud blast and pressure wave without leaving burn marks if combustion occurred in open, ventilated space. And if a hatch had been opened, fresh oxygen could mix with trapped fumes and ignite from a spark, creating sudden shock that frightened but did not destroy, and to a captain with family aboard the possibility of a second explosion might feel imminent, especially if the smell was strong and the first event came without visible flame, and in such a moment launching the yawl as temporary refuge while towing behind would be rational, a way to put distance between people and cargo while keeping ship in sight, but towing a small boat behind a moving vessel in Atlantic swells is dangerous. Lines can snap, knots can slip, and once separated a lifeboat cannot keep pace, and if separation happens suddenly, Briggs may have tried to turn back, but without crew aboard to manage sails quickly, the brigantine would drift onward while the boat drifted another direction, and within hours distance would grow beyond sight, and this theory aligns with missing instruments, organized departure, and lack of damage, while explaining why no bodies were found because the ocean does not return small boats easily. And another factor involves pumps and sounding equipment, because if Briggs believed water in the hold was rising due to faulty readings, he may have feared structural failure combined with explosive fumes, making evacuation feel urgent even if later proven unnecessary. And historians emphasize that at sea decisions are made with incomplete information under exhaustion, in darkness, surrounded by noise and motion that distort perception, and a cautious captain may act earlier rather than later when family is aboard. And alternative theories exist but carry weaker support, such as navigational error leading Briggs to believe land was closer, encouraging temporary abandonment, or sudden waterspout frightening crew into the lifeboat without lasting damage. But these lack combined documentary and chemical plausibility of the vapor scenario, and what unites the strongest explanations is human fallibility, the idea that no single catastrophic event occurred, only a sequence of reasonable reactions to ambiguous danger, each step logical, in isolation fatal in combination. And this pattern mirrors many maritime losses where fear of one threat leads sailors into another, because the sea punishes movement as often as stillness. And by the late 20th century most historians lean toward this chain of events model not as certainty but as least speculative answer, acknowledging that without survivors or recovered lifeboat absolute proof will never exist, leaving the case suspended between evidence and absence, explained enough to remove need for ghosts but never enough to silence the final question of timing, the moment when Captain Briggs looked at his ship, his cargo, his wife, his child, and decided that the open ocean in a small boat felt safer than the deck beneath his feet. In the end, the story of Mary Celeste does not conclude with discovery, confession, or wreckage. It ends with documentation, probability, and silence, because every confirmed fact narrows the mystery without closing it. We know the ship left New York in sound condition under Captain Benjamin Briggs. We know she was sighted weeks later sailing unattended and brought to Gibraltar by Captain Albert Richardson. We know the hull was intact, the cargo largely secure, provisions sufficient, valuables untouched, navigational tools missing, lifeboat gone, the logbook ending days before discovery, and official investigation found no proof of piracy, mutiny, or staged fraud, only absence. And from that absence generations built legends, ghost stories, sea curses, inventions that say more about imagination than evidence. Yet the documented reality is more unsettling, because it suggests that skilled, cautious people following rational steps can still vanish when small uncertainties stack faster than solutions. And modern analysis favors a chain of events beginning with leaking barrels releasing vapor, continuing with a brief ignition that alarms but does not damage, leading a responsible captain to evacuate temporarily with family and crew into the yawl while towing behind, and ending with a line parting in heavy seas, separating boat from brigantine beyond recovery, a scenario supported by chemistry, seamanship, and human behavior, but still lacking final proof that would move it from theory to verdict. And that gap is where the case remains not a supernatural puzzle but a historical limit, where records, weather data, and forensic reasoning bring us to the edge of understanding and stop reminding us that oceans erase as effectively as they connect. And the irony is sharp, because the ship survived the crossing better than the people who commanded her, sailing on under wind alone, while the lifeboat built to save lives became their likely tomb. And historians accept this not as failure but as boundary evidence, can reconstruct probability, not certainty. And the lesson is not that the sea hides monsters but that it magnifies consequence, that at sea decisions must be made before clarity arrives, and sometimes the safest choice in the moment becomes fatal in hindsight. And that is why the case endures in maritime history, not as legend but as study, a reminder that even in an age measured by sextant and chronometer, the greatest danger was often uncertainty itself, the moment when a captain must choose between two risks with incomplete knowledge and history records only that he chose, stepped away from a sound vessel into an open boat, and was never seen again, leaving behind a ship that could tell us everything about how she sailed and nothing about why the people who trusted her walked away.